Okay, so in the last lecture we talked a little bit about the history of philosophy and other things after Plato, with specific focus on the Islamic world. In this lecture, we will obviously background to Aquinas, so focus more on what happened with Christianity. Again, the same basic thing. Socrates put to death by Athens. Plato, his student, founded a teaching school called the Academy, as sort of again, a school for teaching philosophy, wrote the dialogues. They seem to have been used in the academy. Almost all, or so far as we know, all of the dialogues survive. Plato's student Aristotle, obviously another great philosopher, wrote many types of works, including dialogues. Almost none of Aristotle's dialogues survive. He wrote many treatises. Even the treatises, it's a little bit unclear sometimes whether they're notes, whether they're the official work. Sometimes people debate the order, what order the books or the chapters should actually be in. So Aristotle's works preserved much less completely than Plato's, maybe in part because Plato, maybe part of the academy, part of the purpose of it was to preserve the dialogues, again, as teaching instruments, but also obviously as philosophical works. Aristotle's works suffered something of a they just were not preserved as completely. But again, Greek philosophy spread to Rome as well. Ancient Rome had philosophy, etc. Copied a lot from ancient Greece, but in any case, philosophy was part of society and part of the civilization in ancient Rome as well. And of course, that's Christianity kind of emerged around Jesus was born. Of course, the traditional calendar AD BC, of course, is centered on the birth of Jesus, replaced sometimes now by Common Era or before Common Era. It's the same calendar. So obviously, Jesus was born not actually in Rome, but as part of the Roman Empire, and as Christianity emerged as a sort of religion after the death of Jesus, of course, very, very different from Islam, which sort of exploded and took over a large part of the world, and almost immediately emerged again as a sort of as a political force, as a source of political power, and as a sort of again a whole civilization which included political power. Christianity, by contrast, as it emerged, well, of course, it was very famously, persecuted with more or less fervor in different times in different places, but it was illegal, and it was often persecuted, and it didn't become basically legal and sort of emerge into the public world in the ancient Roman world and the ancient Hellenistic Roman world until the early, until the early 300s AD, and when it did, again, it was emerging like Islam. It was kind of emerging into a world, a civilization with a very long, very well-developed philosophical tradition. But again, Christianity, though it was kind of, once it was made legal, it was sort of favored by people in power. It was not yet completely combined with political power. And as it emerged, it was very quickly one of the things that was important to early Christians, early Christian intellectuals, or theologians, was to give a intellectually compelling case for Christianity. A lot of these early Christian works were called apologetics, not in the sense that they were apologizing for something or stepping on somebody's foot or something, but they were giving a sort of argument for why Christianity made sense. So, in of course, theology, the whole idea of again what Socrates was doing at the end of book 2, using reason to understand the gods or the divine, was sort of a very important part of Christian theology and Christian writing, sort of more or less from the beginning, not necessarily from the earliest moments of the church when it was again illegal and so on, but as it emerged. Philosophy was a very important part of Christianity, a very important part of Christian theology, a very important part of the sort of official culture of Christianity from the beginning, because again, in part because of the circumstances in which it emerged. Now, obviously, eventually, again, the Roman Empire was eventually sacked and fell, and you had what was called the Dark Ages. During this time, from let's say roughly 500 or 600 A.D. or C.E. To well into for several hundred years after that, Europe was in many ways a sort of very backwards place, and the civilization of the Islamic world was superior in almost every way, including philosophically. So in the Islamic world, you had a whole flourishing tradition of Islamic philosophy that included thinkers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna or Ibn Sina in his name in Arabic. Averroes, the most important in terms of the influence on the West, or his Arabic name Ibn Rushd. This is actually where the writer Salman Rushdie, his last name actually comes from this. His father chose a last name from Ibn Rushd, who was a well-known proponent of rationalism in the Islamic world. There was a great philosophical tradition in the Islamic world, and eventually a huge backlash against it, led largely by two people named Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, which again sort of pushed back a lot of this and left very little place for philosophy or even for certain robust rational theology in the Islamic world. But during this time, a lot of the as Christianity developed and so on, and as it started, as Europe started to sort of recover or emerge from the Dark Ages and to slowly kind of build up a civilization and so on again, philosophy was an important part of it. Plato was not actually known at this time. So Aquinas, who we'll be focusing obviously lived during the 13th century, so the 1200s, and Plato was not actually known in Europe at this time. Plato's dialogues were known in the Islamic world. There was a movement called Neoplatonism that obviously after Plato intended to interpret Plato's works in a somewhat more mystical way. But Aristotle was the major philosophical influence in Christian Europe at the time. In fact, Aquinas sometimes, when he mentions Aristotle, he usually refers to him simply as the philosopher. Aristotle was the philosopher. Again, much of this had come in through the Islamic world. In many of the commentaries, Averroes, again, the Latin name, the Arabic name, Ibn Rushd, but Averroes is often known simply as the commentator because his commentaries on Aristotle were considered so important and so definitive. So all of this came into Europe through the Islamic world, and there was this huge kind of crisis. Aquinas, during the time that he lived, there were various dramatic things going on, and he was surprisingly, because he appears to have been a very quiet and reserved person, he was at the center of many very kind of explosive things that were happening. One of them was the emergence of Aristotle. What do we do? How do we understand this Greek philosophy, which obviously predates Christianity? There's no mention of God or the Bible, or there is a mention of God, but there's no mention of the Bible. There's no mention of the Christian God, and yet this guy is claiming to understand and be able to explain everything. What do we do about that? How do we reconcile or relate this or somehow make sense of this? In terms of our religion, and of course there were sort of two extreme versions. One was to reject it, to say, well, this is sort of bad. This is untutored, unguided human reason like this. This is going too far. It's sort of too much, claiming too much power for human reason to understand these things. And then there was another somewhat more underground version, which were known as the Latin Averroists. Again, the influence of Averroes, the importance of Averroes. They were known as Latin Averroists, who we won't get into a lot of what they were saying, but basically one of their kind of distinctive arguments was that there are two different paths to the truth. One is religion and the other is philosophy, and the two are totally distinct, and philosophy should go ahead in its own sphere and figure out whatever it wants to, and philosophy doesn't need to defer to religion. And then another teaching of the Latin Averroists was, and philosophy is superior, by the way, so sort of clearly a much more strongly rationalist, even sort of critical of religion. It was a movement that was, again, kind of critical of religion, even kind of dismissive, many people thought. So that was sort of the sort of Aristotle, very pro-Aristotle, and then the very anti-Aristotle, who said, we don't need this philosophy, this is actually dangerous. Aquinas was sort of in the middle, and his famous phrase, philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. We'll see what some of what that means, but his basic view that philosophy and theology, religion and reason and revelation, Aristotle and the Bible, these things can be harmonized, they can be brought together, they actually fit very well together. But philosophy, contra the Latin Averroists, philosophy needs to be subordinate to theology or to religion, and we'll see how he works all of this out. So Aquinas only lived to be about 50. He was actually born into a noble family in Italy. And another very dramatic thing that was happening at this time was that, of course, the Christian church during the Middle Ages, especially during these, well, really the whole time, but maybe even more dramatically so during the early Middle Ages, was very corrupt. And there were two mendicant orders, in other words, orders who would basically pledge poverty, that reemerged trying to live a more authentic version of Christianity. The Franciscans, who were founded by a guy named Francis, and the Dominicans, who were founded by someone named Dominic, and Aquinas wanted to become a Dominican. Both of them focused on teaching, but the Dominicans even more. The Dominicans were very much focused on teaching. And again, both the Franciscans and the Dominicans, they took vows of poverty, so they basically said the church has become wealthy, the church is a powerful social and political institution, as you probably know, and it's become very corrupt, so we're going to reject all that. We're going to reject all of the worldly benefits and goods that you could get from being part of the church. We're going to reject all of that. We're going to take a vow of poverty and focus on actually living the way that the Bible says, the way that the Christian tradition says, and really focus on the reality of what we think the religion is about, which is not worldly power and wealth and comfort and so on. So they were kind of reviving Christianity, but of course they were very controversial. They obviously they were able to be brought into the church and made part of the church, but obviously in many ways they were threatening people in power. They were basically saying that the church is so corrupt that we need to found wholly new orders, and again, that we need to take somewhat extreme steps in terms of doing things like taking a vow of poverty. And Aquinas very much wanted to be a Dominican. And his family was very opposed to this because, again, they were aristocrats, and they thought, look, there are positions in the church that are respectable, that you want to be a priest, you can go and be, an abbey or something, be in charge of a monastery. It's, but you need to do something that's respectable. You're not going to go be one of these weirdos who takes a vow of poverty and just goes around teaching and so on. That's not, you're not going to go live in poverty. That's not fitting. He was insistent. He really wanted to be a Dominican. His family actually kidnapped him and held him in their castle. And at one point, his brothers thought, well, the problem with this kid is he's just naive. He hasn't really experienced much of the world, hasn't experienced much worldly pleasure. If we introduce him to some of this, then he'll sort of wisen up a little bit. He'll come around. He'll understand the way that things are, and he'll be more more amenable to reason, and he'll realize it's not that bad, and so on. So they actually hired a prostitute to seduce him, hoping that after he had tasted a little bit more physical pleasure, he would become less determined to go off and become a Dominican. But when the woman went into his room, he actually, poor woman, he just chased her out with a poker from his fire, and then burned a cross into his door. So it didn't work, and eventually his sister helped him escape. He went off. He became a Dominican. He studied theology, studied with Albert Magnus, or Albert the Great, who was the great teacher and theologian of his generation. And then Aquinas spent, he's probably most associated with the University of Paris, which was, along with Oxford, one of the very first universities founded in Europe. And he taught and obviously wrote a great deal. I mean, the amount that he wrote in a very short, and really a pretty short life, it's kind of unbelievable, just the volume of work that he produced. And obviously the quality and the influence that it had is even more impressive. But so he basically lived as a Dominican, taught and wrote a great deal, obviously. And we'll be reading the Summa Theologica. We'll see how he introduces that in the next lecture. But basically, he had, again, a relatively short life. Mainly, he's usually identified chiefly with the University of Paris, where he taught a lot. Again, when he was, traveling at some point, at the end of his life, he was saying Mass one day, and then afterwards he said that all of his writings were like straw, and then died shortly after that. And so he said all of my writings are like straw, in the sense that they're not actually valuable, they're not actually important. And then died shortly thereafter. The kind of the pious interpretation is that he had a mystical vision and realized that all of his attempts to understand with reason were nothing compared to the actual vision, or the actual sort of real experience of God. The less pious interpretation is he had a stroke or something like that, and then died shortly thereafter. In any case, whatever happened, why ever it happened, whatever the actual reason is, very few people have agreed with his very self-deprecating comment that he made there at the end of his life. his writings, again, were very actually controversial in the generation or so after his death. He was still not fully accepted. And again, there was a lot of controversy over whether he was some kind of a heretic, whether this should all be suppressed, whether he had actually said the wrong thing. But eventually, not that long after his death, he was accepted. His view sort of prevailed, and his view again that reason and religion, reason and revelation, philosophy and religion, Aristotle and the Bible, the idea that these things can actually be harmonized and brought together, again with religion clearly the more important and the more authoritative element, but this idea that these things could be brought together obviously became hugely influential. He was named a doctor of the church, one of the definitive or authoritative theologians in the Christian tradition, and then later after the Reformation in the Catholic tradition. The Reformation actually rejected a lot of what he was saying, though not always singling out Aquinas by name. And actually after the Reformation, he sort of fell into eclipse to some extent. A lot of Catholic, obviously the Protestants, depending to some extent, what is basically recognizable as Thomism was much more a part of, say, Anglicanism than of Lutheranism, and of Anglican theology than of Lutheran theology. But basically, he was not the sort of authority for Protestant theology that he had been for previous Catholic theology, for previous Christian theology. Again, after the Reformation, Catholic theology for a while was very concerned with the Counter-Reformation, with arguing against Protestants, with showing why they were wrong. So Aquinas kind of fell into eclipse, but in the 19th century he sort of reemerged, and he sort of reemerged as one of the authoritative teachers in the Catholic tradition. Again, in terms of, in many ways, Europe was poised in a particular very dangerous, but really dangerous situation where it was unclear. Aristotle's emerging. It's not entirely clear how this fits in with our religion, which is obviously not just pure philosophy. What should we do? Again, in the Islamic world, there was a huge backlash against philosophy, against the philosophy inspired by the Greeks, by Plato and Aristotle, and so on. And there was, the same thing, something very similar could have happened in Europe. The fact that it didn't is largely due not just to Aquinas. There were many other theologians too who argued, but Aquinas is sort of the central and probably the most important, the most influential figure who argued that Aristotle is not actually a threat, and that these things can be again reconciled in some way and brought into harmony. By the time people started to really rebel against that idea, philosophy and reason and some of the things that Aquinas had helped to defend and so on were so well established that it was too late to just try to overthrow them. So even though certain Reformation theologians sort of rejected a lot of this, what they thought was a too rationalist version of theology, much of what they were concerned about had already become such an integral part of European civilization that it was too late to try to get rid of it completely. Again, the influence of Aquinas, even if you're not religious, even if you are not Catholic, his influence in the development of European civilization and philosophy and so on, very hard to overstate. Finally, the final thing is the method of writing here. So when you read these things, what you'll notice is, again, we're going to be reading from the Summa Theologica, and what you'll notice is that these are divided into questions, but the questions actually are usually just titled as sort of broad subjects. So the nature and extent of sacred doctrine, or question 2, the existence of God. It's not actually a question, it's just a statement of here's the broad topic that this will deal with. The individual articles, so the questions are divided into individual articles. The individual articles are the actual questions, the one that actually pose specific questions. Is the existence of God self-evident? Can the existence of God be demonstrated? Does God exist? So these are specific questions in the form of articles. So when you start to read an individual article, the first thing you'll actually see is it will say objection 1. And then there will just be a statement of an argument, usually fairly brief. And it always begins with, it would seem that, and then they'll say, it would seem that, God does not exist. And so Aquinas writes all of it. So everything that you read is written by Aquinas. The way that the articles are structured, so when questions are structured into broad, the questions sort of, each question is a collection of articles. Each article is a specific question. And the way that the individual articles are structured is the first thing that you read are a series of objections. And those are written by Aquinas, but those are not his position. So what he actually does is he sets it up so that you start with objections, people arguing against his position, then his position, then he replies to the objections. And again, he writes all of this, but it's clearly an attempt to be sort of Socratic, to sort of show, here are the arguments against it, here's what I think, now I'll reply to those arguments. As you're reading it, you may actually find it much easier just to skip to the middle part, the block of prose in the middle where he explains his own view, then read the objections, the arguments against his position, and then his replies. Starting with the objections, then reading his view, then getting back to his replies to the objections, you might find is a little bit awkward, or just it's easy to forget what the objections are. But again, he writes all of it, but he writes arguments against his position. So the first thing you see are the different objections, and again, the objections almost always begin, it would seem that, and again, for example, it would seem that God does not exist. So as soon as you see that, Aquinas is going to argue that God does exist. You probably knew that anyways, but he always argues against the objectors. Okay, so it starts with objections, then there's a part that begins on the contrary, and this is called the sed contra, because in Latin the term is sed contra. And it's usually a very brief statement where Aquinas will usually say on the contrary, and then he usually cites an authority. So he'll usually cite the Bible or a theologian, or sometimes he'll cite Aristotle as the authority. But usually it's just sort of on the contrary, and then he'll say, no, somebody else, an authority, says the opposite. And that's, again, just a very short part called the sed contra, where he says on the contrary, cites an authority. Then there's then the next part begins with I respond that, and this is called the responsio, because in Latin the word is responsio, and that's where he sort of explains his position in some detail, where he sort of explains it, argues for it, sort of really kind of explains this is so here's the authority says that God does exist, and now here are the arguments for why God exists. Here's why I think this. And then he'll go back and at the end reply to objection 1. So he'll reply to the individual objections at the end of the article. Okay, so again, Aquinas writes all of it, but the objections are not his position. The objections are the position that he's going to argue against. So again, you might find it easier just to jump to the part in the middle, the sed contra and the responsio, where he explains his own views, then go back and read the objections and the replies to the objections, or read the objection and read each objection and its reply, and then read his part in the middle. But reading the objections, then the responsio, then the replies, that might be a little confusing, or you might just lose track of what exactly the objection had been. So again, there's a clear way to write. He's writing a kind of disputation, again, trying to show these are the arguments against, these are the arguments for, and trying to set up a kind of dialogue with his possible objectors. Again, these were used for educational purposes, but also, again, he's just sort of showing, look, this is what you should do. You shouldn't just state your position and just sort of say this is the way it is and everyone needs to accept it. You should explain, and not even just argue for it, but try to show these would be the best arguments against my position, and here's how I would reply to them.